Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first of a series of town halls with the AIA California's Urban Design Committee. I'm Rona Rothenberg, AIA California's Vice President for Government Relations. Before I introduce our moderator, Frank Fuller, FAIA, just a few housekeeping items to note. Today's session will be recorded and made available on our webpage and on YouTube channels following the event. The discussion does qualify for AIA learning units. For AIA members who stay on for the duration, staff will submit so you can sign up for your credits, and the learning units should appear on your transcript within 2 weeks. Following our short presentations by each of the panelists, we'll open up the floor for questions. Please do use the Q&A box for your questions located in the upper or the lower menu bar of your Zoom screen. And you can also, in participants, you can raise your hand. If we've missed you, I hope we don't, and we will endeavor to cover everyone's questions. Now on to the town hall. AIA California's Urban Design Committee welcomes 5 experts in our field who have developed a series of town halls that will look at the intersection of public crises and urban design as we look to the future of urban living beyond the pandemic. Over the next few months, our experts will discuss how urban design fosters cities to become more resilient, maintain sustainable densities, improve livability for all in the public realm, and what opportunities and challenges the design profession faces as we contribute to improve our world. Today's moderator is my colleague, Frank Fuller, FAIA. He will set the stage for today's town hall. A bit further before introducing our diverse panel of speakers. Frank is an architect and urban designer who has practiced in the United States for over 3 decades. In addition to architectural commissions, he's helped to transform downtowns, town and campus centers into active pedestrian-oriented places. He's lectured widely, nationally and internationally, and is a partner at the Urban Field Studio. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you, Rona. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Even though it's virtual, we can't see each other except in these little boxes on our screen. I have to let you know that the headlines in all the papers this morning were not exactly positive. A lot of what we're going to be talking about are in every day's newspaper. And even today, as we look outside of our windows, it's still dark at past 8 o'clock because there's an orange sky, because one of the things that we have to contend with is fire and smoke from fire today. There are many issues that we have, but before we get into that and our expert panelists, I want to thank Hillary Kreck, Mark Christian, Nathan Ogle, who all have really made this possible through the American Institute of Architects California Council. I also wanted to make sure that I thank Gwyn Pugh, who is the president of the Urban Design Committee of AIA California, and all the Urban Design Committee members. This has taken a while, of course, as these do, and to ask our panelists to take their time and to put the effort into this is something that is not easy. And here we are all virtual doing this. So thank you to all of them. So here we are, pandemic, pollution, justice, fire, sea rise, climate change, earthquakes, inclusivity, equity, and education. And I didn't even talk about politics. I mean, there's a lot that is confronting us today, and urban design has a role to play. Matter of fact, architects have a unique set of skills and a unique way of thinking, which allows us to be broadened in our way of addressing things such as urban design. And we're going to hear about this morning from 4 people. When we started this, my most general question I had was, what do you think are the most relevant urban design ideas, models, thoughts, and actions for the future of resilient cities and the livability of their communities? That sort of generally captures what we're talking about this morning. But then what we did is we asked each of the panelists a question, and we'll certainly have more, and I know you will have more. So once again, thank you everyone out there in webinar land for joining us. Our first speaker this morning is James Rojas. And James, I asked the question of, is it most important to listen to the community and to start with fundamental questions before initiating any design work by professional practitioners? And of course, as we asked all of the panelists, you take all the questions we ask and you either throw them away or answer them the way you want to. They're mainly to get the thoughts going. So that's what we're doing this morning. So who is James Rojas? He's the founder of Place It and Latino Urbanism. James is an urban planner, community activist, and artist. He has developed an innovative community visioning method tool that uses art making to remove barriers and provide authentic and meaningful input. He's facilitated over 1,000 workshops and built over 250 interactive models around the world, from the streets of New York and San Francisco to Mexico, Canada, Europe, and South America. James?
Hi, good morning. Happy to be here today. I'm gonna, so Frank gave me the question about how do we listen to communities, but for me, the question is, how do we get people to express themselves in the way they want it, in their own voice? And that's really the key, is having people express themselves. Because all of us have different ways of thinking about the world, and we need to have different ways of expressing ourselves. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you about this issue about expressing ourselves. And the whole idea is getting people to tell their story in the way that they see fit, and getting people to think about planning as part of their lives. This is a project they did in Bakersfield on the High Speed Rail project, and we worked at a senior center. Most of women probably didn't care about the High Speed Rail, but they do care about the community, and they do care about moving around. So how do we transform this infrastructure into a lived experience for people to say, I want to be part of this? So creating the safe space is important for people to have different ways of saying what you want to say. So this is working to create a space with people that speak Spanish. So what I did, I developed this 1 hour workshop that's called Place It, that uses art making, storytelling, and play as a way to get people to express themselves. So this is a deeper way, a different way of thinking about space and your body in space. So basically what I do is have people kind of build as the first activity their favorite child memory, because a lot of people may not have a vision of the future, but they do have memories and do have experiences that they could tap into to create that vision. They want to kind of equalize the process of how people build a favorite child memory using objects in their hands. Because when people use their hands, they use more of their brain cells. They're thinking big, they're thinking a lot of options. So you want to give people this kind of option to really think about how color and memory and shape impact their lives. Plus, when they use their hands, they start thinking about their body and about the landscape, not about the not about the policy or plan. So, and you want people to really talk about space in a really physical, very visceral way that we as architects and talking about the intimate connection that people have with the landscapes around them. So building a favorite child memory helps people think about space and how important landscape plays in your life, because all these memories are in a place. So having them build that place makes them really understand that they're they're part of this process. And so so also when they build the space, I tell people this memory is your DNA for urban planning. This is your go-to memory that you're going to always try to find consciously or subconsciously in your adult world. This is a story that we want to uplift to put in the current transportation plan or housing plan. So now everybody has a voice in the planning process. So this is working with the LGBT community. How do you think differently, deep about about who you are and what you value? Because I think for us, it's really important to really bring people together and find our core human values and find what binds us together. We can be bound together by place. We all live in the same street. We can be bound together by sexual identity. We're all LGBT. Or we could be bound together by an issue, global warming. So really thinking about what binds us together and how the best way to kind of think about how do we start the planning process. So it happens people can transform idea in their head, and say, how does this, like an artist, how does this idea in my head become a reality so I can negotiate, really think about it in the future. It's just like when Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, it was the idea in his head. But when he painted it, it was like, wow, my idea became reality. And this is what gives people power, is that they can have this idea that just kind of floated in their head. Once they put it on paper, once they build it, it becomes negotiable and tangible and real. That gives them gives them the idea. This is a workshop I did a couple of years ago. We asked people to build their ideal bike path. And someone built the red. The red means where she lives. The black means where she works, and the bike path in between was the forest. She wanted to have a good experience getting back and forth to work from home. This is a way to express herself with that, which is really great. And also, how do you listen to your body and landscapes? This is a workshop I did in Oakland, where I asked a group of women, how would you make Oakland safe for you to walk at night? They build these models about Oakland, as far and what their body reacted to at night, and how they could change that. So giving people the idea that they can change the built environment is one way to kind of empower them. Because like for a lot of women, this one woman said if the BART station smelled like urine, that means a man was drunk, exposed himself, misbehaving. She was out of there, just from that one little smell. So you realize that people's bodies have different kind of senses. They deal with the built environment, and we need to really capture these kind of senses, these kind of ways of thinking in our tools. But you can't really do this on a map or on words. Sometimes it has to just be built. Because now people can negotiate and think about these kind of these kind of ideas that shape their lives. So also, I think also for me, it's also how do we produce knowledge? How do we just go beyond just giving out information but produce knowledge? Sometimes people have this knowledge inside them about the built environment that they never get to really share, but having to build it, that knowledge comes out. I'll do many workshops with people, and they'll say, "Wow, I never thought I knew so much about parks, but until I built a park." So you want to get people to produce knowledge out of their own experiences, and that's can help in the planning process. So after people work individually, they work in teams, because like what I tell people in planning, there is no right or wrong answer. There is no solution yet. It's just how our ideas affect each other to create a solution together. And when people realize that, they can plan together. And by using objects, they can think about spaces and negotiate space really easily. With words, it's hard to negotiate space. With objects, if I put the pet advocate and the car advocate on the same team and say, now you build your ideal street together, they can negotiate the spaces. If it's just words, they're just going to argue until one gives up. So again, this is a good way to people to negotiate and think about, how they're, and also how ideas evolve. I could put down one thing on a piece of paper, and the person next to me does something else. So all of a sudden, these ideas kind of grow and they kind of blossom. So people realize that they need each other to help this plan work. And you really want to kind of create that kind of environment for people to really be, happy working together and have positive experiences. So also at the end of the day, you also want to encourage self-determination. We tell people, your ideas, your models, your plans. Now it's all up to you to make this happen. Because far too often, as planners and architects, we control the whole process. Therefore, it's like, well, you planner did this and said that and planned this, and then it doesn't happen. But this way, if we tap into people's lived experiences and what they can and can't do, they'll be able to move this forward on their own. So for me, it's really important to really think about self-determination in this whole kind of expressive process. This will help people really kind of move the plan forward, on their own with this, with the city, the other people involved. But again, it kind of pushes people forward to think about my ideas, my place, my experience, my solutions. Anyway, so that concludes my presentation about expressing yourself. Thank you very much, Frank, for inviting me. This is my contact information. Thanks. Finished. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So here we see that you can build knowledge. You're not just building buildings, and building knowledge and with that a kind of an inclusivity and engagement is remarkable and necessary. So I want to thank James and now turn it over to Catherine Moore. And Catherine was asked a question by me. How does an urban design practitioner and policymaker see the future of urban development with our current situations in US cities? So, of course, I don't know if Catherine's going to actually address that question or not because she doesn't have to. But let me tell you a little bit about Catherine. Catherine is a fellow at the American Institute of Certified Planners, as well as an associate member of the AIA. She's a planning commissioner in the city of San Francisco. And a couple of sentences about Catherine. Catherine Moore's influence in community service and leadership, both in the profession of planning and in the public advancement of urban design, can be seen worldwide. Communities, neighborhoods, individuals, and colleagues have been positively impacted through her career as a planning studio director, private practice planning practitioner, and I had to practice that phrase, community urban design advisor, and currently as a San Francisco planning commissioner. Catherine?
Good morning, everybody. The sky indeed is orange to gray, and it is an unusual day to try to participate in a very upbeat conversation. I like to start with a slide with two pictures of Dolores Park in San Francisco, one before and one after COVID-19. And the question that comes to mind, particularly today after this, with this orange sky, is, will social distancing exercised over a long period of time lead to social recession? A very grave question, but recent events are raising questions and challenges for all of us in the profession. And how will we respond? Do we have the tools? Do we need to create new tools? And are we ready for potentially reimagining the city? I'm trying to respond to Frank's question, but you'll find me weaving in and out precise questions, because for me, the issue is somewhat more global. Just to bring you briefly up to San Francisco and its response to resiliency, over the past plus decades, San Francisco, like other coastal and cities and communities, has focused on resiliency with strategies on climate change, sea level rise, seismic preparedness, and energy independence. For those of you who practice in the city, you are very familiar where the groundbreaking projects are. For the rest of our practitioners, there are quite a few of them. They are quite involved. And as we go through some other observations today, you'll see how complex the issues are for San Francisco. The question to density, San Francisco for the least 8 years has focused densification and on priority development areas. For you, again, practicing in San Francisco, you will recognize Mission Bay, Showplace Square, the eastern neighborhoods, and all colored dots here are defined those districts that are indeed under consideration for rezoning and extended neighborhood-specific plans, all with the intent for densifying the city in a community-wide, neighborhood-focused manner. Some with success, one with lesser success. Let me tell you briefly that I will not be speaking to you as a planning commissioner today, but I will share with you a glimpse from that perspective. I see immediate new challenges arising from COVID-19, its after effects, and how questions arise that have never been posed before are in front of me literally every week. And the challenges are calling on all of us, because it is not just planning commissioners and planning asking what should we do, but it's practitioners in front of us often raising questions that have never been brought together before. What I see surfacing is that we all will be pressed to define a new post-pandemic normal. This will involve looking for new tools in design-based problem solving, as well as changes possibly in design standards. There's something even larger. and that is the pressing question of racial, social, and environmental equity, which has been very loud and very, very precise in San Francisco planning circles. And that particular question will require for all of us to take a deeper look into issues that we have not addressed in the past. Why are 4% of people of color in our city accounting for 25% of deaths in this pandemic? Why in Marin County are 16% of people of color accounting for 71% of all coronavirus cases? That type of statistic leaves me speechless. And when I, in the public dialogue, have community representatives speak urgently for us to consider that in our decision-making, I believe that we need to pause. With this in mind, and while we are searching to define the new normal, there is no denser and more livable city for any of us unless we, a livable city for the future, unless we shift our policy focus and our urban design interventions to more comprehensively address these issues. What does comprehensive mean? What are potential new tools? Everything starts with resolutions, declarations, and manifestos. The Planning Commission of San Francisco has indeed taken the step. That is a declaration to practice with a focus on racial, social, and environmental equity. A new challenge, which at this moment is trying to find its physical form, trying to find its day-to-day engagement in every decision we make. That is not an easy thing to do because beyond words and stats, we do not have many physical tools yet by which we can objectively address that issue. So what tools are available while searching for new metrics in the post-pandemic practice? Let me describe to you one example in the search for you. The San Francisco Planning Department is taking a deeper look trying to create new tools. And this year's summer intern program, which was conducted remotely for the first time, has produced some astonishing results. A graduate student from the University of Michigan has created GIS-based story maps, which I'll share with you in a few minutes. What you'll see are beginning points for useful tools to examine the hows and wheres of racial, social, and environmental equity. Combined with clear policy, these tools can become ingredients for new metrics for change. These are first attempts. I found them astoundingly impressive, and for that reason, I will go into showing them to you. Some of you might say, well, what's new here? When you start to look at all of them together and look at them in composite form, I think there are messages emerging, which I believe could set guidance for new ways of thinking. We start with understanding where we are, and we are trying to understand where we are going. These particular two slides speak about growth scenarios between 2015 and 2040 in San Francisco. There are immense projections for growth. When you take them into statistical and physical manifestation, you need to understand where growth can occur under current standards. Where will we be forced to shift them because of an analysis which may require us to look at growth now focused on particular areas and redistribute them more equitably into other areas. This particular set of slides, and there are 4 of them, shows where we are going relative to household growth, employment growth, aging population, and population growth by children. Again, we're looking at the same time frame as before. The darkest areas, and that's pretty obvious, are those areas where the majority of these growth scenarios is falling. And again, you see an unusual weighting to very particular parts of town. And you're kind of wondering, when you bring that into the context of equity and everything which comes with it, why is it only these few spots? Let me talk to you about the metrics of environmental factors that influence growth and where we can grow. We have sea level rise, we have stormwater flooding, we have liquefaction risks. Try to keep those color spots in your mind as we move forward to other climate variables. We have air pollution, we have heat vulnerability, and we have social vulnerability. And let me, for a moment, get into explaining to you what comes together when mapping social vulnerability. The reason why I do that is because I think, depending on your screen size, mine is relatively small, you may not see the criteria which are being weighted here. There are 12 criteria starting with renters, children under age 5, very low income, non-US citizen, people without vehicles, people with disability, single parent family, community of color, people 65 or older living alone, limited English proficiency, no high school degree, people with housing cost burden situations. I'll pause for a second and I'll move on to show you the composite of environmental findings. And there is a maximum score of 12 points, which is the maximum climate hazard risk score for a neighborhood in the city of San Francisco. And again, as you see, compositing all the criteria that we just went through, we're primarily seeing the impacts in the eastern part and the eastern waterfront part and slightly inland for the city. Moving on, there is the issue of health hazards, which brings us to today's situation, that is, where do we see coronavirus vulnerability? And lastly, I want to bring that again into the context of social vulnerability. And as you look at those two images, there's a very close relationship between contamination and coronavirus vulnerability in conjunction with social vulnerability. And I'm going to show you again a composite of those factors called total community vulnerability. In this particular case, there are a total of 15 points, which is the maximum community vulnerability risk score that any neighborhood can receive. Again, we're seeing a strong consideration in areas that we have seen before. I believe that these tools, these are analytical tools, will allow us to look at every design decision, at every project, at the urban scale, at the site scale, at the building scale, at the details we use for those buildings, to re-examine what we do and where. And that we are looking for unbiased, more informed site selection, design decisions, and how we approach the restructuring of the city overall. For those of you who want to dig deeper, here are a couple of references that are available for everybody. City and County of San Francisco, Hazards and Climate Resilience is more for those who practice here. San Francisco BCDC is for the Bay region at large, particularly Bay-facing communities. And then there is general information about climate change and social inequity, Department of Economics, as you see here. Let me close with where I started. Dolores Park, social recession. This picture is Hearts for Parks. reminding us to keep an open heart as we're moving through these difficult times. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. So you can see from Catherine's comments how city planning and architecture come together along with art, as James has pointed out, to make urban design. And those comments are so valuable. Thank you for the summer intern program and the University of Michigan student for compiling those maps, which are quite sobering. Next, William Gilchrist is going to present to us and give us some of his comments. So I asked Bill a question, which was, are large city urban design moves able to be created by public and private enterprise? And can they create futures with sufficient resilience and justice? Which of course, he's free to do with as he will. Let me tell you a few things about Bill. He's the Director of Planning and Building in the city of Oakland, California. Director Gilchrist has 35 years of experience as a planner and designer. He was Director of Place-Based Planning in New Orleans, where he focused on the city's design and development strategy. He was previously a Senior Associate at AECOM in Atlanta and Director of Planning, Engineering, and Permits in Birmingham, Alabama. Bill?
Right, thank you very much. And we'll get the screen up and shared. Hold on one moment. Okay. We are going to take a little different lens, and I'm going to practice as much elasticity in responding to Frank's question as he will grant me. But as much as I appreciated Catherine's forward-looking, examining the current conditions we're facing, and the new skill sets and tools that we really need to hone in order to address these challenges, I also would like to put forward the argument that much of what we're facing, both in terms of urban design's engagement around the social construct of communities, around dealing with health and environmental justice, and looking at all the parameters that really constitute cities and strategies, has been within our portfolio for most of our professional existence. And what we have in front of us here is a plan for Los Angeles of the Olmsted vision. This was done in the 1920s. The plan was completed in 1930 for publication. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with, or most of our colleagues in the architecture profession are familiar with, the contribution that the Olmsted firm did generationally, both that Frederick Law initiated with his great work in Central Park, but also the generational work that his sons carried on, where thousands of parks, thousands of open space and integrated architectural compositions benefited from their scale and their perception of what landscape could be in cities, what landscape could be in terms of an expression of democratic society, what landscape could be as part of an opportunity to improve their health and access across class for people who might not have the means or wherewithal to escape the densities and pressures of urban living to get to more bucolic settings. They strove to bring an integrated and sensible framework of green space into the cities. So at the same time in the 1920s, when the sons, Olmsted's firm, who were running Olmsted's firm at the time, had set up their studio to address multiple projects they had in the state of California, out of their studio in Redondo Beach, they were also completing the 1925 Park Master Plan for Birmingham, Alabama, with which I became very familiar through the course of my work, particularly in the implementation of some of the stormwater and flood management programs that we set forth in the 1980s, 1990s, but that in 1925, the Olmsted firm had actually shown the city how it could move forward, both in terms of granting a great amenity for citizens across the length of the city, but also as a means of stormwater management and environmental enhancement. Birmingham, Alabama being a gateway city at the end of the Appalachians, and the topography being quite striking. Many people who come to the city for the first time, the first impression they get is how hilly and mountainous it is. And of course, for every hill and mountain range, there are valleys and there are creeks and water tributaries that complement the topography. And as any city built within that kind of environment, Birmingham had some challenges around managing its floodplain and flood events. So as was part of the approach that the Olmsted firm often enacted in cities, was not just looking at the recreational opportunities it provided for its citizenry, but also to see how the park system could integrate as a climate control, topologic control, stormwater management system as well. And in 1925, the firm came out with one of its most brilliant interventions, I think, in terms of addressing those issues. And Birmingham grew, as a post-Civil War town, grew at a remarkable rate. In fact, it received the moniker of Magic City for its growth rate, referred to as the Pittsburgh of the South. But the confluence at the base of the Appalachians of the iron ore, of the limestone, of coal, that really suggested that it would provide great opportunity for industrial development and became known as the Pittsburgh of the South. And with this growth, you see before you the railroad reservation where the city initially established itself both for the export of its manufactured raw materials, and the railroad reservation will figure prominently in the future development of the city. But it was part of the intention of the commission that as the city grew, as it expanded its industrial base, that it should receive the focus of significant planning initiatives to help bring some order to the expansive growth that was occurring. So Warren Manning, the Boston landscape architect, did the first plan in 1919, and then the Olmsted firm came in the 1920s to really focus on the green space. But what also occurred in the 1920s was an affirmation by the Supreme Court in 1926 in the Euclid case that affirmed the police authority of local jurisdictions to enact zoning as a regulatory process with the force of law to establish patterns of development, location, character, extent, height, density, all those things that we're used to dealing with as designers when we have to bring projects before planning commissions, building code officials, et cetera. But in 1910, the city of Baltimore had initiated the first race-based zoning. And in 1920s, the city of Birmingham and many other cities throughout the South, and a few outside the South as well, used the legal power of zoning to enforce segregation, particularly around housing patterns. And what you can see on the map, the traditional use of colors for heavy industry, for housing, for light industry, for retail and commercial, but a finer grain overlay of hashing, identified particularly for residential designations where Blacks were restricted. And the zoning code itself articulated times of day where Blacks could be found, where Blacks had to be within the neighborhood designation for residential zoning, segregated zoning, and with certain dispensations around the type of work they may be doing that would allow them to be outside those zoned areas. So this again was adopted in 1926 and really became a model of that kind of application of zoning for the purpose of ensuring segregation. And again, other southern cities and a few cities across the nation also adopted this system. And it seems perhaps an extension that of a civil rights movement and reaction that used the idea of marching, that used the idea of people being in a place that they quote unquote were not supposed to be based on regulation, that really brought civil rights marching, particularly in the South, as a tactic that both challenged the framework that was inherently unjust, and also used a means and methods that most Americans could relate to, just the freedom of movement, being able to go from point A to point B. And as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, you'll recognize the Reverend Martin Luther King, also Ralph Abernathy, and the gentleman to the left, whom you might not recognize, is Fred Shuttlesworth, who essentially laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement within the framework of the 1950s and 60s protests, and brought Martin and Ralph in, along with other organized groups that had received national prominence to advance the civil rights struggle in Birmingham. And again, given the history of patterns of restriction and where zoning was a instrument used towards that end, Reverend Shuttlesworth acknowledged with Reverend King that Birmingham would be a remarkable focus nationally and internationally to test the limits of what civil unrest could do to bring about social justice. And Birmingham has come as expressed through many venues and many initiatives to recognize the contribution it made nationally and internationally to the civil rights struggle. This is the Civil Rights District, the Institute being the anchor institution there in 16th Street Baptist Church, was designed and developed by the late Max Bond, who I had the honor of working with on this project. But in the live memory, again, of the conversations around social justice, the thought of Black lives mattering. This is not something newly confected in our day right now, right here. This is a conversation that has been going on since the inception of the country, with different iterations of engagement in order to move us towards a more complete system of inclusion, justice, and opportunity. And as Birmingham grew, both in terms of its contribution that it was making to the civil rights discussion nationally and internationally, it also evolved away from its industrial base. The University of Alabama at Birmingham became a major presence downtown in terms of both its land use, its focus as a academic center of excellence, and particularly the medical institution, which became one of the major centers nationally and internationally of medical innovation, and was one of the major focuses of folks coming into the city to receive those services from around the world. Birmingham also grew as a banking and finance center, and until the great consolidation of banks in the 80s and 90s, was the second largest banking center after Charlotte, North Carolina, in the Southeast. But something else occurred in addition to the evolution around the changing economic base of the city. In the 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, Birmingham established a neighborhood association program that the Brookings Institution held up as a model of community and citizen engagement. Initiated through the CDBG response for community involvement, some of the areas of the city that did not qualify for CDBG funds also wanted to participate in what was framed as a robust and engaged neighborhood participation framework. So the city council established a system that included every square inch of the city within a neighborhood framework. 99 neighborhoods were established, constituting 23 communities. So every square inch of the city of Birmingham, Alabama had a neighborhood association, and they all worked within the same framework of constitution, of officers, and of engagement with City Hall and city processes. So one of the advantages that they gave us in the planning, development, urban design arena, certainly those of us who worked in official capacity, was a forum that included neighborhoods across all demography, all race, all locations, and engaging any initiatives that we wanted to undertake around urban design or planning. And in the exercise that I would like to run through rather quickly on the update of the City Center Master Plan, I went before the Citizen Advisory Board, group shown in the upper left corner, constituting 23 neighborhoods that represented the 23 communities that represented the 99 neighborhoods, and asked them, before we even thought about putting together a scope of service, what would be the best way for us to engage community as ongoing partners in reconstituting the city center plan. And the city center, again, as in most urban developments, urban areas, the downtown, the city center is everyone's second neighborhood. What is very interesting reaction from some of the community leaders, the representatives on the Citizens Advisory Board here, was that some of them felt quite estranged from downtown, that they didn't feel that their own neighborhoods were receiving enough attention, and were a little reticent in terms of how they might want to connect or engage a downtown process. So they acknowledged my good intention, they welcomed me to the forum, but asked me to go, come back next month, and they'd have an answer for me. So when I returned, what was decided, and this was a decision by the neighborhood leadership, by the community leadership, that if, in looking at the map, we provided them all the information in terms of the extent and location of the study area, that if we included in a significant way the 14 neighborhoods that either were bound within the city center designation or adjacent to, if we made them active partners, the remaining 99 neighborhoods would be good to go. That we had to honor the people who were there in that place. And interestingly enough, this area for the city center master plan and the adjacent neighborhoods included among the richest and the poorest zip codes in the state of Alabama. So we had a truly fascinating mix demographically, racially, economically of constituents within this study initiative. So what we did was to meet 3 times with each of the neighborhood associations before we even thought about putting together an RFP. One was to hear their concerns, both writ large, what was specific to their neighborhood, what were their concerns and aspirations for the downtown. We came back to make sure that we heard them correctly, and finally came back to let them know how their concerns were being constituted in the request for proposals. So one of the focuses, one of the projects that came out of that initiative was the railroad reservation. You remember the block print that I showed early where the city was founded. You can see the state of repair and disrepair that this area, that this core, this heart location of the city, central location of the city fell into. It was a brownfield, EPA designated site. And through a series of initiatives that both the city and the state were able to undertake, which I can go into detail later if there's interest, we were able to procure the property, the city was, with the idea that we were going to try to reprogram this at some point into an open space or green space for the city, which was severely underserved in terms of downtown common green space. And because of the input that we received from the neighborhoods and the communities, we put out our RFP and were able to bring in Urban Design Associates from Pittsburgh to work with us on this project. And again, a firm of architects that had a strong inclination and skill set towards urban design. David Lewis, one of the founding partners, also being one of the initiators with the RUDAT program for the American Institute of Architects. But they did a masterful job, largely because the city had already established its framework for community engagement. The steering committee for the program constituted neighborhood presidents, as well as the president of UAB, as well as representatives from the banking industry, in one room, one time. No siloed conversations, no backroom deals, everything out in the open in terms of what the priorities were and where the focus was going to be. So again, using the skill sets that urban designers and architects can bring to a conversation to help make these aspirations more visible in terms of where we may be moving. Urban Design Associates, again, for much of the work and style and approach that our good friend and colleague Ray Gindres really crafted with the firm, was able to bring forward imagery that, again, the community could react to in terms of seeing themselves in the picture, in terms of understanding what the nature and character of the opportunities to design may be. Not that this was prescriptive, but again, it was thematic. Are we getting it? Are we within the ballpark community of what you would like to see and vision? And as a result, because we had such a girded engagement and inclusion, we were able to move forward with the execution with a broad range of community support, both from foundations and from private sector investment, Frank, to answer part of your question, but also because we had the political support and groundswell stewardship of the outcome. The community across the board wanted to make sure that this was going to be a successful park and a park for them. And again, realize you're in a downtown heavy industrial background and development history that comes from a city, comes out of a city that had a history of public space being severely segregated, made its moves forward through the constitution and creation of a neighborhood and citizen advisory group and neighborhood associations that took direct control over their destiny and were able to engage with us in a role of leadership, not just stakeholder with whom we meet on occasion and check the box and show some pretty drawings, but that they were at the front end of the confection of the goals and intent of the project, as well as the tail end of making sure that we got it right. And again, the proof is in the use. You see within the park in its execution that at any given day, a broad range of use, a broad range of representation, a broad range of demography, that one of the hallmarks of the success of this project, again, has been that everyone in the community feels that it is theirs, for its size, for its location, for its nuance, for the range of experiences that it offers, whether it's one person or an assembly of people for performance, as you saw on the earlier slide. It is really a park for the people. And it is also, as many good projects, engendered iterations and incremental changes and movements forward. We've had a great partnership with the Auburn Studio, which has been really a great adjunct also for the neighborhoods and the communities to help ideate new thoughts and bring forward new recommendations for implementation. So again, where the railroad cut, again, an old spur line that was abandoned, actually changes grade in downtown. That was a thematic extension of some of the work that was done at the railroad park when it was implemented. And again, much of the development that you saw sketched up in the UDA design, which again was based on analysis and economic and data input, the fact that the university redirected its investment efforts towards the park, which also helped secure and stabilize communities to the south, again, was realized through very thoughtful engagement and analysis. And again, one of the interesting milestones was at the baseball field that had moved out of the city during the 50s and 60s, again, as a result, in all likelihood, to the desegregation movement of Birmingham in response to court orders and social progressivism to become a new community, again, renewed itself through much of these conversations and initiatives where the ballpark moved back in town and is located directly across the street from the railroad park. So we have, again, a regional amenity that had moved out of the city, moving back in. Again, I feel very strongly due to the nature of the project, its execution, and its success. And it has become a point of pride and a point of expression for the city. Again, something that was incubated in the community with neighborhood associations, with outreach, with engagement. Again, a skill set that's not new. This is not something that we have to invent or look to do. There are many good examples across the country of people who good work like Catherine, like James, like Renee, who have engaged communities for the best outcome in terms of interventions and addressing issues of social justice, of health, of recreation, of open space, and of inclusion. And again, when the work was well done, it's well done. Whatever the genesis may be, it received enough attention both through its execution and through the response. The New York Times focused on the role that this project played in the resurgence and reinvestment in downtown. And one of the most interesting aspects in terms of community ownership, you see in the lower right corner, a shed, which is the terminus of one of the streets that tees intersection at the park's edge. And this is a shelter, again, that's used for any number of improvisational exercises, uses, gatherings, etc. But there's open furniture there, and the furniture is safe. It has not moved, it has not disappeared, but it is very much like Bryant Park in New York, where you can go in and arrange the layout, that whatever it is you need that space to be at that time, there is enough fungible furniture there that you can make that happen. And because of I think both the quality of outcome, the engagement and participation in the process, the project also was nominated and received the ULI Open Space Award in 2012 against some, what you can see, pretty stiff competition. And this is not what it's about. We're really not about trying to do projects that necessarily have to get to magazine covers or receive awards. But it is important to understand, particularly as designers, that the quality of outcome does not come at any trade-off in terms of neighborhood engagement and participation. We will have better outcomes that really stand the test of time and use and achieve design excellence, the more community we can engage around the table in the determination of its scope and intent. And again, the proof is not in the awards, but in the use. That you can see on any given day that this park in a community that has moved forward and moved through its history of segregation, still many challenges to face, as all of our communities do. But this is an example of work that was able to be done, again, through the engagement and participation of community at the front end of conception. And I would also point out, colleagues, that we have great examples within our organization, within the AIA, to look at as well. The Regional Urban Design Assistance Team has a portfolio of hundreds of projects that it has executed over its decades of implementation, both in disaster response in neighborhoods and also dealing with more inflected or subtle impactions that communities may face. It's a program that only comes into community through community initiative. A community group has to invite the RUDAT team in. This is not a top-down solicitation. It is one where there is clear community engagement in terms of articulating the challenge and also in formulating a commitment to implement. There has to be a sense on both sides of the question called and the action taken for RUDAT to come in. And it has been a wonderful, wonderful benefit to many communities, again, that may have some nuanced challenges or some very existential challenges that they're facing, where the design disciplines, multidisciplinary, including planners, landscape architects, urban design is a shared realm across our professions, where we've been able to come in and address many communities at the baseline of their needs. But again, participation and engagement being at the cornerstone of the success of those outcomes. And again, we are facing, as Catherine mentioned in her presentation, another milestone in this ongoing conversation of social justice and equity within the American story. This picture I took from my office on June 19th, as Oakland participated in one of many national rallies across the country in protesting, again, the resurgent evidence of inequity, of injustice, of unequal treatment under the law. And the challenge, again, being placed among all of us who do this work who provide physical form to community, how can we respond most effectively in helping to address these issues, and at the very least, making sure we first do no harm. And I would just like to close out that for communities that do not have this kind of structured neighborhood association program that cities like Birmingham or Atlanta do, that's still no excuse not to get to community. The community is there. And in the case of East Oakland, the East Oakland Neighborhoods Initiative really led the way. They came to the city with their proposal focused to pursue a grant from California for transformational climate communities, initially confected to address issues of climate change in disenfranchised communities, but also now taking a resurgent focus, given COVID and other questions of environmental justice, on how we at city government, private investors, not-for-profits, and other institutions can engage with community leadership to ameliorate and improve the conditions that they face. So that's what I have to say, and I look forward to our engagement, and thank you so much for having me as a part of this.
Thank you, Bill. It's so wonderful to hear the story about the heart within the heart of Birmingham. And did I fail to mention landscape architecture? So many of you have talked about different ways that the landscape is influencing what we're doing. And I'll have to give a small plug here for the Urban Design Committee, because what we've been trying to do with an award program in California, American Institute of Architects, is to team with the American Society of Landscape Architects in our Urban Design Award program. Because as you can see from the examples we've already talked about, whatever we're talking about with resilience and density is important. So I just want to put that in front of you.
And also, Frank, if I may, I'm sorry, one thing I do want to say just to throw in along that point, that the park was designed by Tom Leader, a great California landscape architect. So I just want to make sure that his work was recognized there. And he worked beautifully with the community.
And Tom is currently going to work with us in Petaluma, California, with another technical assistance program of Urban Land Institute. We try to bridge over many different organizations. It's not just the American Institute of Architects, as you can see, with the community, hopefully, as Bill has pointed out, as our base. So that leads me to introduce Renee Chow. And it's important that we talk about the College of Environmental Design, because way back in whatever it was, I think the 50s, but help me with Renee with this one. The College of Environmental Design was formed where various disciplines were put into one place. Landscape, at that point, design program, which is much more like manufacturing design and that kind of look at the world. Architecture and planning are put into the same bucket in the College of Environmental Design. Renee Chow was the interim dean of that institution last year while there was a dean search going on, and right now she's the chair of the architecture department at the College of Environmental Design, University of California, Berkeley. And so I asked Renee this question that actually Bill touched on, which I thought was very helpful in the Birmingham example, which is, are historical precedents and academic research showing us the way for better urban design to meet current community crises? So I'm not sure if Renee has even dealt with that question, but she's going to tell us some things. And here is just a couple sentences about Renee. She also is a principal with Studio Urbis, her firm, and she has put this sentences in before us. Urban challenges of the 21st century, increasing porosity, reducing resource consumption, and accommodating urban diversity, require solutions that are locally rooted. Renee's research, teaching, and active practice revolve around innovations in integrating urban and architectural systems across sites and individual buildings. Renee?
Well, thank you, Frank, and thank you to AIA California for inviting me to join a fabulous group of panelists. Frank, that's the first time I've heard Worcester Hall called a bucket. I've heard it called many things, but that's the first time I've heard it called a bucket. So, we keep hoping that epidemics will disappear, but we know that contagious diseases have continuously threatened and disrupted human populations, and very vividly today, how and where we live. Health crises, social and economic inequities are now compounded by climate crises. I keep looking that way because I look out at the orange sky outside my window. There's something about these crises that lead to desires to identify quick and universal answers and truths as responses. But what makes architecture and urbanism complex is that what we build should and does endure. While we want revolutionary solutions, we have to remind ourselves of the evolutionary consequences of what we do. We can look to our history to see how cities are shaped by past global revolutions. We live with that progress and then discover that those solutions have to be taken with a grain of salt. To quote my former colleague, Nicholas Desmonchaux, who's now left Berkeley for MIT, unfortunately, quote, "Much has already been written about how this pandemic provides an opportunity to remake or redesign cities. But such statements mostly reveal our recent pharmaceutical era amnesia about the inextricable history of disease and urban life," unquote. During the 19th century, cholera carried by contaminated water was the concern. In London, this led to new sewage systems. In Paris, the revolution of the sewer system led to the grand boulevards and public spaces that sat on top of them. If we look at water, the development of centralized sewage, stormwater infrastructure, and treatment plants became the norm for all cities. Unfortunately, the failure of these systems is now appearing. Last week, I had the opportunity to hear David Sedlak speak. David is author of Water 4.0, a book I highly recommend, and he vividly describes our impending systemic water crisis in a time of precipitation volatility. In some places, there's too much water. In others, there are going to be chronic shortages. In California, unfortunately, we'll have both. Our pipe networks and treatment plants are falling apart. In the next round of urbanism, will it be decentralized interventions that depend not on global systems, but on local interventions? If we take light and air, in the second half of the 19th and 20th century, tuberculosis was the pressing health concern. Beatrice Colomina theorized that much of modernist architecture can be understood as a consequence of the fear of disease, a desire to eradicate dark rooms and dusty corners where bacteria lurk. We all know the story. Le Corbusier lifted his houses off the humid ground to avoid contamination. His proposal for Radiant City was intended to eradicate the medieval, unhealthy donkey cart city with a vision of residential towers set in open space and set back from the white streets for the emerging technology of vehicular travel. And while Radiant City was never realized, the proposal was and continues to be propagated throughout the neoliberal world, with the growth of Chinese cities as perhaps a prime example. Today, we understand that this form of urbanism is dependent on top-down agency, amassing of great capital wealth, assumptions of limitless material resources, and a dependence on technologies, both vertical and horizontal. Today, as elevators form private mass transportation that are now limited by COVID, and vehicular transport only seems more important, it doesn't mean that it has to be seen as the antithesis to the walking city. The need for light and air also drove the development of zoning and land use regulations, all in hopes of preserving the public health and public good. And as Bill just so carefully illustrated for us with 100 years of hindsight, we now see how that intent has been manipulated for separation and racial exclusion, yet the need for light and air has only grown in importance. So as our response to the crisis of the time, using applications of emerging technologies and capital wealth as global fixed, I think are now viewed with some deserved skepticism. So where do we go now? What crises do are amplify inequities, but they also highlight the things we really care about and have always cared about. Good housing, street life that supports chance encounters, and environments with good air, light, and water. So I'll end with 3 quick propositions toward this end. First, architecture and urban design in a time of crisis should be more local. We need to be very wary of singular, universal solutions when it comes to the physical environment. Solutions that will be environmentally just will be locally rooted in the geology, in the geography, in the microclimate, and in the peoples of each locale. We seem to be seeing this image a lot today. Second, urban design in a time of crisis should be more porous. Density will still be needed, but it needs to be finer grained and much more permeable, again, to air, light, and water. And while we'll still need green parks, this is not nearly enough. We'll need to unpack our building forms and weave in collective access and public access to spaces that increase livability. Last, architectural design in a time of crisis must be more robust. Architecture should be built both to last and built for change, designed for things that we cannot foresee. So I do have a thesis that I'm going to offer to you as a group based on sort of observing the history of cities. And that is the forms of our cities are somewhat accidental. They've emerged to address crisis after crisis that we have tried to address, but I don't think they are as intentionally planned as we think that they are. And so we still have much to learn about the design of good urbanism. And so if I can leave anything as a lesson, I think it should not stop any of us from being revolutionary thinkers, so long as we acknowledge evolutionary consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. So that is the talk of our 4 excellent speakers, and excellent it was, from art to incredible city examples to mapping where things are actually occurring, to examples of the heart of cities and how engagement works, to trying to figure out how intentional we really might be. So now we're opening up for questions and answers. And if you look at your Q&A at the bottom or the top of your screen, you can ask those questions. We're going to be here for a little bit longer. It's almost 10 after 9, and we're going to be here till 20 after. We'll stop at about, 3 minutes before the end so that Rona can give us a little, wish us well and make a few comments at the end. So first of all, we have a question on the Q&A here, which reads, Bill Gilchrist, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. You showed the civil rights marches of the 60s shaped zoning in Birmingham. How do you see the Black Lives Matter movement as a force reshaping today's cities?
I see it very much reshaping cities, again, particularly around questions of environmental justice in communities of color. One of the correlations, and I know that it's in there in the layers that even Catherine showed, but you can look at many cities across the nation and find where communities of color are located around other choices of land use, around heavy industry, around transportation, back of house facilities. that there has been often an historic legacy of the location of communities of color in land uses where there's had to be mitigation. And as we move forward with overall plan updates of comprehensive plans, of general plans, there's an opportunity there for us to address much of that in terms of different sides, approaches towards zoning, towards land uses that then might call for certain down zoning or reprogramming of sites. The other aspect of city development, I think that Black Lives Matter and other focuses of social and environmental injustice bring is the provision of basic services around infrastructure, around how green a community is. Where are the parks? Where are the spaces, open spaces? To Renee's point of porosity, to me that implies a certain distribution of amenities across communities that have more, so they can have more equal access. And then certainly while I showed in the case study a major park, a large park in a city center, the access that neighborhoods should have towards appropriately scaled communities, appropriately scaled amenities is also critical. So as part of the conversation around equity, that again is being punctuated by the Black Lives Matter movement, what we do as urban designers, as planners, can be informed directly to address concerns and inequities. We need to hear, we need to listen as well to the protests and to engage in conversations, to come before the forums of Black Lives Matter, but also make sure when we set upon our work around land use, zoning updates, urban design, and as Frank said, with other partner professions, that we do seek out communities that often are not at the table, that we make a proactive effort towards making sure they are engaged before we let the ink get to the paper, let alone let the ink dry. So I do see that there will be definite outcomes in terms of the work that we do as a result of the social movement. But again, we can't predict that literally, not until we've had the conversation with these communities as partners.
James, do you have anything to add to that? But you're muted, James.
A lot of my work is based on Latino urbanism and the way Latino do space. And I think what I'm finding now is that our planning codes are just so restrictive that they're kind of cracking. We can't handle global warming because our plans are set up by the Pilgrims and the early forefathers, right, for market-driven economies. But now different things are shaping cities, and how do we evolve and rethink cities? And I think for Latinos, we come from a long line of indigenous roots, embedded in Latin America, with Spanish mixing and slave mixing. We have this kind of way of kind of reshaping things and evolving into new forms of identity. I think we need to think about planning as the evolutionary process, not just right and wrong, but how we absorb different elements into the cities to really kind of start thinking about how do we deal with the different issues that are arising with this. So I see that we need to have more kind of evolutionary planning policies, but not so restrictive.
I would agree.
This question leads to an interesting thing about where we are, which is currently we're all in the West. Of course, we're in the West of the West in the Sacramento, San Francisco Bay Area. But one thing that occurs and has occurred, which is not getting the same amount of attention maybe as Black Lives Matter, which of course is critical, but I heard a talk by Andres Resendez recently, who's at UC Davis, who wrote a book called The Other Slavery, about our whole West experience with the slavery that occurred with Native Americans and later is reflected in Chicano culture and Latino culture. And it reflects on all of what we're doing now with the issues that we have from the plains to the Pacific with our different crises. I don't know if anyone wants to talk further about that, but I think you were touching on it, James, and I think you were touching on it too, Bill. You've been dealing with the whole nation, having dealt with New Orleans, Birmingham, you were in Atlanta, now you're in Oakland. I mean, it's an incredible diverse set of challenges for a diverse society, particularly here in Oakland. That's kind of a question, kind of a begging for your opinions.
James, I'll let you take it first.
Okay, well, I just think, again, a lot of it's based on this market-driven economy that kind of gets implemented through zoning. So you always going to have winners and losers. You know, in the South, it was African American slaves. In the West, it's probably been indigenous populations and really cheap Latino farm worker labor. So it's all a product of our economy, and you know, and how we think about space in a really definite, you know, simple way. But now I think with all these things cracking, with global warming and you know, and we need to really think about how planning has to kind of change from this kind of market-based society to more of an inclusive, maybe socialist, or maybe more of an open, more just society. But I think we really need to start thinking about our economy as changing to really, and planning to really address those kind of new issues.
I would agree, and I don't think we're going to have much choice of that matter, because even if you look at the impacts on cities, and we're talking primarily coastal cities, perhaps a sea level rise, or even other climatic impacts that we're facing as evidence with this orange sky, these also end up getting monetized. At some point, someone has to cover the cost of dealing with these adverse outcomes to infrastructure, to property, to human life, and without recalibrating. I think, James, as you're suggesting, that I was looking at the model at the front end through some different lens than we have traditionally, we're going to find ourselves very ill-equipped to address the challenges that are facing us. And one of the things I might suggest too, thinking about all the speakers' points, James, the process you have of engagement, I've had an opportunity also to work with that approach in East Oakland, and it is a brilliant way of engaging community, not just around the comfort association of the items and the artifacts they work with, but there's also a comfort that I have found, at least from my experience, with communities' engagement than when we do move to plans, when we do talk about other visual information of our craft. Because of what you've confected, there's almost a limbering up of connectiveness, of the ability to have a conversation as folks who deal with graphic information with the community now that has been able to walk in that world because of the kind of process you've put together. Catherine, the data-driven layers that you were looking at for San Francisco, this is good information also, and I think it goes right to James's point, to show where we are facing probable outcomes or eventualities based on data right on the ground. You know, as John Adams said, facts are stubborn things. And we can look at all these approaches and this information in tandem. And then looking at Renee's conversation and the challenges around porosity she lays before us, to look at how we approach design in a more inflected and evolutionary manner in response to these findings, to what we are able to adduce from the observations that we receive through community engagement processes, through the data-driven overlays and information, Catherine, that you show, that I think we want to look at all of this together, Frank, in terms of how we move forward in our response. I think we've had a very good array of presentation of approaches in helping to get us there. Catherine had raised her hand, I think, just now. You're on mute.
Just in response to the written question that came in for Bill, I believe that we are at a point where, while Black Lives Matter is really what's pushing us, we need to take that powerful movement to look at a definition that is broader, and that is people of color. And as James said, and as everybody else hinted, it is not just our Black population, it is indeed our Latino population, it is our indigenous population, and everybody else in between. I think we need to come to terms with that the white voice, which has dominated the description of urbanity, which has basically led major decision-making over the last 100 years in urban design and architecture, needs to be broadened to have larger aspects of our diversity come to the table, just as James was describing, as Renee was hinting. We need to broaden the discussion. And we need to be more honest, not only about the background, why we're making decisions, we need to basically engage everybody. In many cities, contrary to what we see in Birmingham and the built-in structure of detailed neighborhood participation, we need to create the courage of the public voice to shape of how we are looking at the future of our cities.
Agreed.
Thank you.
And it's
So I
been
see
more than 100 years, Catherine.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, it's interesting because, I've done 1,000 workshops with people all over the country, and people never, at the end of the day, people never build a bigger house or cars or parking.
There you go.
They never
Right,
build that
that's right.
because
That's right.
they don't really want that. But it's just that, but when you ask them what they want, they'll just say a bigger house and more parking. So we have to go deeper and kind of go to our, kind of reflect on our core values as human beings to kind of get the solutions that we all want.
Except for a certain part of the segment of the population, we are describing increasingly smaller units. We're down to 280 called micro units or whatever. And we are basically targeting particular parts of the population to deal with densification and minimizing while allowing unrelentless maximizing for mega mansioning. They're both poles within the city, and they're very, very difficult to gauge because we're destroying sound, correct size housing to allow mega mansioning on one side and densification on the other side.
So I see we have a couple more questions. This one actually I think goes right to what a couple of you were talking about. It's how is a shift to work from home going to impact cities' financial districts, that's in quotes, and downtown, including the business that serve it? And what does the Planning Commission take on this? I'll give that to you first, Catherine.
I can only speak for myself because what I will say will not necessarily be addressing everybody's sentiment here. I believe that the crisis we are in allows us to re-examine densification by reusing existing buildings for a new purpose. We have done that once before. We have plenty of buildings that may have exceeded the useful use, not their useful life for what they were used for. We see a shift in, for example, the building type of office. And I believe that there may be buildings in downtown San Francisco that could easily be adapted to reuse for residential or a combination of residential and office. Instead of only tearing down and building new, which given the costs and the limitations that we have, we should be looking at active reuse, not in terms of just what I'm trying to say is, let's look at buildings we can use for residential because residential is the most pressing issues we face.
I would agree. And the only thing I would add is that I think it also speaks to how we regulate, that we need to think, to James's point, we need to think about the rules that we have on the books now around zoning and perhaps in some cases even building code, that they can be a little bit more flexible and less restrictive in order to be adaptable in the way that Catherine suggests. Because the market is certainly going to have one outcome based on what's occurring now with remote work, but to repurpose many of the buildings in the way that she's suggesting, which I agree with, it become incumbent on us to change much of the way we've done business in terms of how we regulate development.
And then I would like to pick up on Renee's challenge that we need to introduce a couple of other factors, that is porosity and livability, because by simply adapting to further densification, we are not really meeting the challenge that we really need to meet.
Yeah,
Renee,
I just wanted to add a comment that I think we will learn a lot, because if in fact we are reusing buildings now for a new use with this big change, some buildings we will be able to reuse for housing and work, and some we will not be able to. Right. And why is it, deep floor plates with center cores are going to be much harder to reuse for live work than other building types. And we shouldn't design those anymore then.
Catherine?
The deep floor plates originally were PDR, and they were basically manufacturing, and I think we can recapture some of them for the purpose that they were originally designed for, and they were basically taken away from PDR to become office buildings. But by the same token, again, picking up on Renee's comment, I do believe that we need to reinterpret some of our open spaces. San Francisco has the famous popos, many of them looking more like lobby entries to office buildings. But I think if we are looking at residential as reuse, that those open spaces, while they're located correctly, need to take on completely different functions, and they need to indeed continue to protect access to particularly sunlight.
So Catherine, what's a popo?
That's a publicly private open space. That is the early 80s agreement between, it actually, I think, originated in the time of Alan Jacobs' reign as a planning director, where every office building needed to provide a certain amount of open space in exchange for the density by which they were allowed to build. So you see different open spaces like near the Bank of America, the Pyramid, and that are small open spaces all attached to entryways to buildings, and they have different forms of publicness, yet in most cases they are transitional space from street to building lobby.
James?
And I think what's interesting in the work that I'm finding is that how important urban design is for people. And by really having people talk about their intimate connections with the built environment is what we need to do. And that kind of information you can't get on a map or through words, but having a woman design her ideal street and what it should feel like and look like is really important data that we need to start collecting. Because I think with our maps and our small scales, that just falls through the crack. So we're not building a place that people really want to be in. So really start with that human experience, that human connection can really give us better urban design in the long run. Because people don't become their own experts in the design field.
So we're within a couple minutes of 9:30, and we have a few more questions, but we're not going to be able to get to all the questions. I apologize for that, but I think what we've been able to talk about, I hope has been helpful for everyone listening. And I now want to turn it over to Rona to give us a few closing remarks.
Thank you all. That was really very stimulating, thoughtful discussion. So thank you very much, Frank, James, Catherine, Bill, and Renee. I'd also like to thank Nathan Ogle, Gwyn Pugh, and Maria Ogridziak, as well as Mark Christian, our Director of Government Affairs for AIA California, and our leadership for supporting this. It's a great starting point for our next conversation on California urban design. So please do look at the AIA website for part 2 of the discussion, Housing for All, on Wednesday, September 23rd at 8 o'clock. As mentioned earlier, submit for your AIA learning units. It should be on your transcript in a couple of weeks. We'll be sending out today's recording and the PowerPoint. I'd like to also ask Frank to follow up, since the record will be in the recording of the additional questions. If we can solicit answers to those, we can post those up for you all. As usual, more information on our AIA California website. It's our privilege to be the voice of the profession through AIA California, and any and all questions can be brought to us, and we will address them to the best of our ability as colleagues and your professional experts. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks to our panelists and for everyone who's listening.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.